Again, my name is Barry Bernabe. As Carrie said, I've been working with the town for a number of years now, and working with the finance director and the town manager on how to kind of structure debt service, present some different options to the town. Just two general factors that I tend to like to present before we look at the actual debt impact. Two things that determine the town's cost of borrowing. The first is the overall level of interest rates. Now, this chart right here tells a story. I think it tells an important story. It plots the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, which is the benchmark for all long-term borrowing costs. So if the town were to do a bond issue, it's based off of the 10-year Treasury bond. Now, the story here is that green circle on the left-hand side there up on top is where long-term rates peaked in 1981. Since then, they've been coming down. That green arrow on the right-hand side of that chart shows the all-time low, which was July of 2016. Where we are today is on the complete right end of that chart. And by looking at that, you can see that we are not that far off from all-time lows in interest rates. So that bodes well for a community that's looking to issue debt for capital projects. Now, the other factor that, just one quirky chart that I put in here, the U.S. Treasury bond yield was, it's like about 2%. A quirky thing that we see in other countries, what's reflected in this chart, is that line across the center there is zero. So in Germany, Japan, France, and Sweden, their borrowing cost for their government is actually below zero. But that's a discussion for another day. But nonetheless, the interest rates are very low in this country right now. The second factor that determines the borrowing cost for a municipality is your bond rating. So just like all of us, when we have a credit score for our mortgages, for our car loans, a town has a kind of a credit score, and it's a bond rating. So from low to high, that column on the left-hand side is a rating scale from Standard & Poor's. I highlighted the town's rating, which is AA+. So the town of Bloomfield is one notch from a AAA, one notch from West Hartford, one notch from Greenwich, one notch from Darien. Very high bond rating, something to be very proud of. A lot of it has to do with the professionalism in the town, the policies and the procedures, the fiscal discipline is all reflected. And there's actually 5 major rating categories that determines your borrowing cost. That determines your bond rating. And here's the 5 of them right here. And the first one up there is management practices. That's a quarter, it's 25% of the town's rating. Town always gets very strong ratings there. They assign what's called a financial management assessment, FMA, which is really the quality of the management professionals. And the town always ranks very, very high on that. They get the strongest rating possible. The second category is economy and demographics. They like to see economy that's growing, businesses moving in, housing values moving up, because the more your grand list grows, the more that mitigates the impact of taxes to pay any debt service and all the other costs. Number 3 and number 4 are really controlled by the town. Financial performance, fund balance levels, fiscal discipline, debt management. Later on in this presentation, we're going to get into some of the debt management, but the rating agencies like to see that debt is planned into the future, so that you look at your existing debt and look at proposed debt and try and structure it so it mitigates any future debt service. And number 5, the last one, is long-term liabilities, and we see more and more of those long-term liabilities starting to put a lot of pressure on operating costs, especially for large municipalities in the state of Connecticut. So all those 5 factors come together that determines the borrowing cost, the town's bond rating, which is the AA+, which is very good. So when it comes to issuing debt, there's really 2 general types. The town could typically start by issuing what are called short-term BANs, BANs, bond anticipation notes. In a recent sale in Connecticut for the town of Plainville, they issued short-term notes for 1 year at 1.4%. And then when the projects moved along quite a bit and you got your arms around the cost, you typically do what's called a bond issue. You permanently finance it over 20 years. And bond rates in the state of Connecticut now for a AA+ rated municipality are about 2.4%. So both of them are very, very low. Short-term costs, long-term costs, 1.4 for short-term, 2.4 for long-term. So now, if we move along here to projects that the town has authorized and may authorize. So working with the town for a number of years now, and what has already been approved is the human services and the public works. So $34 million of projects have been approved. In January of this year, of 2019, the town issued bonds for $12 million. So that leaves $22 million of already approved capital projects that have yet to be permanently financed for the remaining portion of human services and public works. In January of 2020, the town has maturing $7 million of short-term notes that we borrowed last year. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of that money has been spent already. So the town also, over the years, has talked about this proposed library, and the numbers that were thrown around was roughly $25 million. So if you take the $34 million that's already been approved, plus the $25 for the proposed library, that's a total of $59 million. So some of the debt analysis we'll look at the approved projects and the potential for the library. So when we initially looked at that, $59 million is a big number. The initial debt planning that we looked at to try and mitigate the impact of that assumed that the town would bond roughly $12 million a year starting in January of 19. Do it again in January of 20, and 21, 22, 23 for a total of $59 million. So by bifurcating it, by chopping it into pieces like that, you could mitigate the cost for those projects to help soften the impact. That doesn't mean the town has to do it that way. This next chart is a little tough to see, but if you have the pamphlet in front of you, it's what Kiri and I are working on now. As I mentioned before, in column C, it shows that the town bonded $12 million for 330 Park earlier this year. In column D, the town has $7 million of short-term notes that are maturing in January of 2020. And based on Kiri's analysis of all the money that's needed, basically all of that remaining money is needed for those two projects. So in column E, we're going to borrow basically all of the remaining portion of $20.7 million. And keep of that $20.7 million, one scenario we're looking at is to keep $9.7 million as short-term notes, and then bond $12 million. So that in January of 2020, do another $12 million bond issue like we did in January of this year, and $9.73 million, keep it as short-term notes. And what would that look like? How would that impact the town's budget by doing that? So a good starting point is this chart here on page 10. Those blue bars represent the town's existing bonded debt service. It doesn't include any proposed new debt service. So that's the foundation for any debt planning. So those bars are relatively flat in the first couple years, and then they drop off. That black arrow going across is roughly what the town's budgeting for debt service now. So the good news is that if the town were to never borrow again, those bars would drop off, and debt service would go down. When a community issues debt, you have a lot of flexibility to structure it certain ways to actually push it off for future administrations to worry about. Bloomfield historically has never done that, but some communities have. I mean, not to pick on anyone, but Hartford at the time has issued debt in the past and kind of pushed it all off. And what happens is it catches up to you at some point. Sometimes, if they never issue again, their debt was going up. We all know the state had to come in and help Hartford out for a number of other reasons. But Bloomfield historically has always issued debt where it starts to amortize immediately and it starts to run off. And that helps to mitigate any future debt service. So that's existing debt service. So now as we move along, I know this is a little busy spreadsheet on page 11, but what it attempts to illustrate is, on the left-hand side is those existing, in column B, the town's existing bonded debt service. Column C is the delta, or the change from one year to the next if you never borrow again. And that's the same graph we just saw, that it drops off over time. Column D shows the $7 million of short-term notes that are coming due in January of 2020. And columns E and F is the proposed $12 million bond issue that we're contemplating doing to lock in a portion of those two already approved projects. And then the remaining $9.7 million will be bonded next year in January of '21. So in the middle of that page, we're assuming two bond issues to permanently finance the already approved projects for Public Works and Human Services. So as we go from left to right on this spreadsheet, we get total proposed debt service in column I, and in column J, we have existing debt and proposed debt together. And in the last column, we said, well, what happens when we do that? And instead of debt going down in fiscal '21, debt would increase about $958,000. And again, that would be because you'd be bonding $12 million for those two projects that were already approved. And then in fiscal '22, debt would actually increase again, roughly $489,000, call it almost $500,000 again. And then it would start to drop off aggressively after that. Now, to look at that in a graphic format, that spreadsheet is page 12. The blue bars, again, are the existing debt. Those red bricks is the remaining debt service that we're looking to, the remaining capital needs we're looking to bond over the next 2 years. And you can see that debt would go above that black arrow, which is existing debt. And those two lines up top, the red dotted line at the very top is 10% of the town's budget, growing at 2% a year. That's why it's arced up. That's the upper limit of the town's debt policy, to try not to go above that limit. The yellow line, the cautionary line, is 8% of the town's budget, growing at 2%. So you can see in this scenario, we kind of get, we breach that lower limit a little. Now, there's no alarm bells go off. The rating agencies won't get concerned by that at all. It's still relatively low for most Connecticut municipalities. The real issue here is this chart gives you a visual as to permanently financing those two already approved projects. Would push debt service up from about $6.5 million up to about $8 million over the next 2 years before it would start to drop off again. Sometimes the graph is easier to visualize what's going on compared to the spreadsheet. Now, when I first talked to Kerry about this, we looked at it and said, wow, it's going up a lot. Is there any way to mitigate that? There's some ways to kind of defer principal, as I said before, to push principal out. It's historically something that the town has not done in the past. But what we try to do on scenario 2 is to say, listen, instead of bonding $12 million in January of 2020, let's just bond $11 million, potentially, and push another $1 million off for a year until 2021. Now, if you look at this scenario on page 13, scenario 2, if you look all the way over to the right-hand side, so instead of debt going up about $950, it still goes up about $888,000 in fiscal '21. Then it goes up $560,000 following year. So, it does mitigate it a little bit, but it really doesn't move the needle that much at all. And the town would be taking more risk in this scenario because you're pushing more short-term debt out for another year. So you're paying more interest on that, and you're taking the risk that a year from now, that rates could be higher, and you'd be doing that second bond issue at a higher amount at a higher interest rate. So it seems like that scenario 1, the town would have to take some medicine. It would hurt when you put together that budget for fiscal '21. But it would be addressing the capital projects that the town has already approved, the DPW and the human services. Now, one thing that's not reflected on any of these is any proposed new debt. Remember, DPW and human services have already been approved. Now, what would this look like if the library was included in here? Well, this is just a graph for scenario 2. So you can see it's very similar to scenario 1. So by deferring principal for 1 year really doesn't help the town too much. There's going to be an increase in debt service for fiscal '21. But if we look at scenario 3 on page 15, I admit this is a little more busy, but in the middle of the page, in columns E, we see a bond issue for 330 Park. And then in columns G and H, we see the DPW building. And then in columns I and J, we see $25 million for the library. Now, I had to keep this spreadsheet. It's kind of busy enough already, but what I assume for the library, even though there's only kind of one column for it, I assume that it would be split in two pieces. That roughly $12.5 million issued one year and then $12.5 million the next year. So it would be spread over time. So when you look at this, and you go all the way over to column M, again, for fiscal '21, now the library would never even impact next year's budget. The library wouldn't impact until the outer years, but next year debt would go up about $950,000. Following year, it'd go up almost $500,000, $489,000. And then the 2 years after that, it would go up about $250,000 in fiscal '23, and then another $300,000 in fiscal '24, and then it would drop off. So you can see there's 4 blue amounts. That means debt would be increasing for 40 years, and then it would start to drop off. And the last chart here I have is the graph on page 16. That shows, again, the blue is the existing debt. Those red bricks is the DPW and the Human Services combined, and those hash marks is a proposed $25 million for the library. So you can see how they layer on top of one another. They do go above the 8% debt limit. But the good thing with this scenario is if you look at the blue bars for fiscal 2023, there's a kind of a relatively large drop-off in the town's existing debt for fiscal '23. So if the library were to start to hit in fiscal '23, it would really be that existing drop-off in existing debt would mitigate the impact of the library. Now, what these don't include is any other new capital needs that the town may want to explore. If there was Project X, say, that would be lopped on top of these. Again, the good news is if you could defer projects for a couple years and get out there and take more advantage of that runoff in the existing debt, that would help soften the impact of any new projects coming up. So just to recap, the town has a very high bond rating. Overall level of interest rates are very low for both long-term and short-term borrowing costs. But the town has some sizable projects out there. 2 of them already approved, the DPW and the Human Services. They're still in the process of permanently financing them. Those are going to happen. They have to be permanently financed. The library is kind of sizable if it were around $25 million. But as you can see, there would be no one spike in any year that would push debt service up dramatically outside of what's going to happen in next year's budget. Potentially, based on what we're looking at, this $12 million bond issue. So I know I went through kind of fast with that, but hopefully these graphs kind of give you, illustrate how it impacts the debt service. Any questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, I think, didn't we refi a few years ago for lower rates? Is that a possibility? And doesn't that, in effect, becomes desirable to do because the rates are so low now, doesn't that, in effect, push things out a bit?
We already did refinance some of the town's debt, but what happened is that actually mitigated the town's debt a couple years ago.
Yes, I know.
So
could we do that again?
Yeah, there's only so many bites at the apple. We already refinanced all of the town's debt already. So even if rates were to go to 0, we couldn't refinance the town's bonds again because we already did.
Oh, well, so there is now a possibility of doing that right now?
Right.
Okay, a second question I have is, if I can ask you, is if my memory serves me, our debt service was actually higher in 2018, wasn't it? Didn't it go down?
We did, but I believe we pretty much kept the budget flat. I think like $200,000 was taken out of it in budget cuts, but we didn't drop it all the way down so that we didn't have to go all the way back.
I know we planned not to, but I thought that it was closer to $7 million than it's okay.
Yeah, it's like 6.5 million now, 6.6 million.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin?
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. On page 9, where you're talking about your potential for issuing bonds and bans now. I'm just curious, given the interest rate environment and the prediction that the Fed is finished cutting rates and will start going up again, why do we think it's desirable to keep, almost $10 million in bans?
That is a good question. That is a very good question. The short answer I could give to that is if you look on page 11, page 11, which is scenario 1, assumes that we do a $12 million bond issue in July, I'm sorry, in January of 2020, a couple months from now. Now, that $12 million by itself results in an impact to the town of close to $1 million. So you bring up a good point. Carrie and I talked about it. An argument could be made to bond more, but I was kind of afraid to come here tonight and show a $2 million increase in debt service for next year's budget. But so that's what would happen. It would almost double that.
On the other hand, this is not an election year, so it's better to have a jump this coming year than the jump after.
I mean, it is something that
Just to be
So, the other thing with this year is that's going to be our second presentation. We're going to be talking about revaluation. We may get some, bang from that because of the redistribution of who's paying what. So that's another thing to take into consideration. What is the ban rate in this scenario is what?
is, I assume the same thing that playing about 1.4%.
1.4.
Now, you bring up a good point too. So if you remember from my earlier chart, Plainville, a 20-year bond issue is 2.4%. A one-year note issue is 1.4%. So the 1 year is lower, but to go out 20 years is only costing you 1 percentage point more. And it's locked in for 20 years, you don't have to worry about it. So there is an argument to consider maybe bonding more than the 12 million. But frankly, the downside is how much pain, how much budget increase is the town willing to accept? If 12 million results in $1 million increase, if we double that, it's going to be a $2 million increase just in debt service, never mind everything else that's going on in the budget.
Payne was right.
My last question, just very, and I don't know if you did this, in your last scenario where you add in the library project, you split 25 million of bonds over 2 years.
Correct.
Did you do any modeling of this in the sort of usual methodology, which is, well, we wouldn't issue any bonds up front, we would start off issuing bans, then we would issue bonds, so like a different cash flow scenario here where, you did the short-term to long-term switchover. With that I assume that would bring, that would push things out and bring that point where it's hitting the line down a little.
Yeah, if I understand you correctly, if you look at page 13, now, page 13 does not include the library.
Right.
Now, if you look all the way over at column K, so the next 2 years, the town's debt is going to go up one way or another because of the DPW and the human services. But if you look at after those 2 years, and it's fiscal 23 and 24, those are big drop-offs there. Like it drops to 21, 20, yeah, in 23. The town's debt, based on this scenario, will drop over $800,000. So to get to your point is, it's almost, and then it drops $700,000 after that. So there's 2 big drop-offs in fiscal 23 and 24. An argument could be made, if the library does happen, instead of kind of pushing it off, maybe have it hit in 23 and 24, because it really gets mitigated a lot. One of the risks, someone brought it up already, is if you defer it, what happens sometimes, I've seen in other towns, is like, well, wait a minute, debt's going to go down. So what happens is a community will decrease debt service, and then the following year or two, it comes back up. So, being a higher rated municipality, the rating agencies like to see, again, that debt planning, where debt stays as flat as possible. Now, so you invest in your community, in roads and sidewalks and schools and municipal buildings, and you try and keep it relatively flat. But some communities say, well, wait a minute, we're going to wait a while. So debt goes down, they lower their budget, and then debt comes back up, so it looks like a roller coaster. So short answer to your question is, we could do the band thing, push it out more, but because of those two big drop-offs in '23 and '24, it might make sense to have it slot right in there.
Good, thank you.
Sure.
Patrick?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a quick question for you, Barry. I was wondering, at this point, we don't know exactly how much the library could cost, right? So at what point does it become significant in the numbers if that amount was lower? Like, say it was 20 million. Is there a threshold where we would see a significant difference based on the amount we would have to bond for the library?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, from my point of view, running the numbers, if you come back and say, well, it's not 25 million, it's 24, or it's 23, so the impact's really not going to be that much different.
Right, that's what I guess I'm wondering. Where does the impact become more significant? How low will we have to go?
Well, on page 15 again, I know it's a little busy, but if you look at fiscal 21 and 22, all the way over on column M, the $958,000 increase, and then the $489,000 increase. Those two increases are driven by DPW and Human Services. Now, if you look at scenario 3, page 15, the 2 years after that, we're adding $25 million to the town's debt. And your debt is only going to go up $252,000 in 1 year, and then about $300,000 the following year. So it's actually much lower of an impact than those other two projects. The only reason for that is because there's two big drop-offs in existing debt that year. So the library could be benefited from, could get benefit from those two big drop-offs. So the short answer is I'm not sure, where that cutoff would be, but the good news is there are big drop-offs after the next 2 years.
Yes.
Patrick, it's like $80,000 in debt service a year for every million that you decrease it.
Okay.
So, which is, you can ballpark, based on that, so, but anything's gonna have an impact.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor, thank you. I know you first said during your speech and talking about this, you don't have other future projects factor into this model. And one of my concerns is, the one thing that we heard from residents, I know one of my colleagues talked about, this is great, we can go ahead because it's not election year, but the one thing that most voters talked about is their roads, right? And that's a major undertaking. So I would like to see if we come up with a projected amount to see how this will factor into the overall. And that, to me, will give a true picture of where we would be at a town perspective.
You're right. I can tell you this. I work with a number of different communities throughout the state of Connecticut. You're absolutely right. Everywhere I go, everyone's talking about roads and roads. And I've been doing this for 20 years. Usually when I go to a meeting, if people want to approve a project, usually people are there saying, no, we don't need to do it. But for roads, people tend to raise their hand and say, well, why are we only doing $5 million? Why not do $7 million? Get more. So you're right. But again, on that page 16, the last chart, the DPW and Human Services, as I said a number of times, it's already baked in that those projects have been approved, they have to be permanently financed. If the town wants to give priority to the library in the future, that 25 plus or minus number will push debt service up to almost $9 million. So whether it's roads or anything else, absolutely, we could model that in here. But just to give you a visual, we would have to lop it on top of those.
Correct.
So that would just get closer, maybe even reach $9 million.
Correct. And that's my concern.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
again, we're benefiting from a high bond rating and low overall level of interest rates.
I agree.
So if the town's rating were to go lower or interest rates were to go higher, that would push those bars up even higher. So frankly, to cut to the chase, it's really how much, it's like a seesaw. On one end is capital projects for the community, but the other end is how much discomfort from budget increases and debt service is the town willing to assume. 4 years. You know what I mean? So, I mean, we could run those scenarios. Anything you give to Terry?
I think there's two things to remember. The municipal capital grant, they tightened up on what we could spend it on. We really can only spend it on like roads and improvements and the transportation aspect. So we have that, and then we put aside $1.7 million to help fund capital this coming budget year or years to come. So I feel like if we're thinking about bonding for roads down the road, I don't think it would be in fiscal year 21 or 22. I think it would probably be in 23 or 24 if we want to kind of like change the way we do the roads. Because we also have to remember what Public Works what they have the capacity to do, or the vendors have the capacity to do, you know? So I don't think it's something to rule out down the road, but I think for 21 and 22, we wouldn't be in the position to think about bonding for roads, in my
But if we're looking at pushing the library project off for a little bit to, let's say, 23 and 24, we don't know what the interest rate's going to be. And if we're looking at pushing roads off to 23 and 24, so now we have the library and we have roads on top of that. So I think running scenarios would be helpful, right? Because there's other projects besides the roads that people want to get done as well. So taking all of those into consideration, I agree that we can have a little bit more breathing space 23 and 24, but then if we start piling other projects on top of it, we're going to be back in the same situation. Councilor Mann.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. One other element that we've been told has figures into this is debt reserves, which I think contributes to a high bond rating that we've been maintaining around 20%. Correct?
Yeah, the fund balance level, the town does have one of the highest reserve levels in the state of Connecticut, and that plays a big part in that high bond rating, absolutely.
And I'm wondering if there's margin in there for some movement and to create, spin off some money for roads or other, maybe we've been too conservative? What's your thought on that?
Well, it is a touchy subject, the level of fund balance. The danger with using reserves, fund balance, is that once you use it once, say you use it to balance the budget, which is the worst thing to do, it becomes a slippery slope because the following year, say you use $500,000, the next budget year comes along, you're already $1 million underwater unless you use another $500,000. So, but if you say if you want to use it for capital purposes, that's not as bad as using it for just general operations. You can say, listen, what if we take $500,000 and use it for roads? You can, but some people look at that and say, well, how much can we do for $500,000? What if we need $3 million or $4 million or $5 million to really make an impact on roads? I would not recommend drawing that much out of reserves, because that would automatically push them.
So it's a minor consideration.
Right, as long as you keep the amount relatively small, you could, but if you're talking about taking millions of dollars out, that would be a big credit negative.
It's going to hurt you.
It's going to hurt you, right?
Councilor Goff.
Just one other thing on that. I guess we've had a little bit of back and forth on this philosophical discussion before, because I think it's it's obviously an admirable thing in terms of fiscal management that we have the bond rating we do. But sort of to Deputy Mayor Mann's point of view, what he was raising, part of the issue is the reason to have a high bond rating is a low cost of capital. And a low cost of capital really only gets you anywhere if you borrow money, So, if we are nearing the end of the era of large capital projects, we did the Human Services Facility, we're doing the DPW building, we have the library coming up, and there will be other things down the road, obviously, but they may be, in terms of major building projects, probably pretty far down the road. We have some stuff for roads or other kinds of improvements. And then there is also this question of what's the point of maintaining AA+ rating if you're not going to be borrowing? No, I mean, we would never want to fall to single A or something, but there is a little bit of play there because the reason for the high rating is the low cost of capital. So
you bring up a good point. In my opinion, it's really how much pain the town is willing to assume like on this chart, how high are you willing debt service to go? So absolutely, the town could do roads, could do sidewalks, you could do schools, you could do more municipal building. But here's the thing, most communities, when I come out here, and there's $5 million for roads, or $7 million for roads, with an existing amortization like Bloomfield has, that's easy to work in. I usually come out and say, $5 million you could fit in, and debt service is still going to go down. You could do $7 million, debt would still go down. But the challenge here, and I told Karen this, there's $59 million of debt. That's a big meatball out there. That's a big mountain. That eats up a lot. So if it was just different projects of $5 million, $6 million, $4 million, we could fit that in, no sweat at all. We'd be here adding a lot more capital projects. But I think, in my opinion, it's going to take a little time just to digest this $59 million. Get your head back above water, and then we can start exploring all that. Or if you want to accelerate that, absolutely, it's just going to be a very, very difficult without those bars going up higher, debt service going up higher.
Councilor Long?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I just had a quick question. I'm new to the history of this. What is driving the library cost? Is this a placeholder, $25 million? Is this based off previous studies that we've done?
Back in, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, they did hire an architect who gave a prelim number of 25 million, but at this point it's outdated.
That was 20 million.
On locations and stuff like that, so
That
it's not.
number's going up.
Substantially.
You're assuming.
Yeah, I didn't come up with that number.
What happened was Phil last year bumped it up. As he said, all of us who go back as far as Phil and I do, all of us think in terms of inflation. But there was only 20 million in the slot for the library, and he kind of thought it has to be conservative. I don't think so. I think that $400 a square foot we paid for 330 Park. I mean, even if you increase that, you should come out do very nicely with 20 million. But so that is something we have to think about. But that's where it came from.
Do you want us to run another one with the $20 million, or?
I don't think
It's not going to make that much difference.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to make that much difference. Not that much.
Could I make a point? The roads, which has been brought up, and I think it's valid because we have not been spending enough on roads. But the problem also is how much can you spend a year on roads? We've been spending only $1 million a year on roads, and we should be spending $1.3 million. And that kind of goes along with our capacity to do the work. So it would make more sense to bump the road business up by a couple $100,000 out of our regular capital budget instead of bonding it because of that, I think. But I still like the idea of bumping up this next year a little bit and keeping us below that yellow line if we possibly can. If you bump up this year just to 2020 a little bit, and couldn't that be used to keep us under the yellow line in the future? Can that be shaped more? I mean, we really have been for 10 years going through a huge rebuilding project for the schools and now all our town buildings. And this is something, the buildings last 50 years, so we have really placed a huge burden for the last 10 or 15 years on the taxpayer that should not happen again. I mean, after the library, we just don't have any more buildings to rebuild. So, I mean, it does make sense to kind of taper things off a little bit.
I remember going back several years ago when Bill Hogan was here too. It's like, the original game plan from what I remember is these 3 projects, DPW, Human Services, and Library, initially it was like, it was spread, the thought, I thought was like it was spread out more. It just seemed like they all kind of, the DPW and Human Services all kind of bonding it all together at the same time, which makes it a little tougher.
330 Park got stuck in the middle.
Yeah. You're right. It's if there are options we could explore to mitigate that, but the impact here. But again, they're not ones typically we see with a AA+ rated municipality. Again, deferring principal, skipping payments, playing some games like that. We could, but really what that does is it increases the interest cost for the community over the life of the issue. And what it does by pushing it out, pushing these projects that are already approved, by pushing them out, deferring them, what it does is just going to hurt any new projects that you want to come on, because instead of taking the medicine now, putting them to bed, you push them out, it's just going to squeeze more capital projects in the future. Oh, okay. Sorry, it's going on so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
As you guys know, we're in the middle of the revaluation year, coming up near the end, so I'll notice this one out. Starting to get phone calls, people making appointments and stuff in already, so I'm sure you're living in town, you've already gotten yours. I have the reval company here. Sue is the project manager. Jim is helping with the commercial side of the revaluation, and they're here to tell you about, you know, where things are going from as far as the market goes and stuff and everything, so.
There's more people here than we thought.
Yeah, we have a few handouts. I thought it was just a... May I hand me that?
Yeah, I'll give you those, you can...
Oh, I don't know if I can run down the hall. Save you the last in case I need to. I had printed out 10. I thought I was going to have lots of leftovers. No, I need 2 more, or...
Oh, I missed, I don't have a...
Yep. So I'll make a couple more.
Okay, I'm Sue Robinson. I'm with Vision. I'm a project manager. I've been working with Vision for almost 20 years now. And Vision's been around for a long time, doing just revals and writing software. Basically, this is the revaluation that's effective October 1, 2019, so the new values will be in effect for the July 2020 tax bills. People are now getting their notices with little warnings like, no rate's not set yet. And the website is now updated and all that. This was a reval where we were sending. It's set for another height. So, I'm sorry. That's better. Okay, now I can... Okay, so data mailers were sent out last January to everybody. As far as residential improved properties, we got back about 37% of those. About a third of them had changes, 2/3 did not have changes. We did data collection. We data collected all of the commercial properties. We data collected properties that Todd said that we needed to go out on. There were data mailer discrepancies that he needed us to look at, or other properties that he knew about, or also we went out to sale properties from October 2017 to 18 at that point. Basically, we ended up with a 41% entry rate on that. We sent out letters, callback letters, so people could make appointments. We got about a 27% response from those letters, which is included in that 41% entry rate, which is normal. I mean, and town by town, year by year, the entry rates are lower. but I think that's just the world today. People would rather not have you walk through their house. The values, in a nutshell, overall are going up. There is definitely a shift toward the commercial. The last time these values were set was 2014, and we based these values we currently have on, with the residential, it's based on the sales that occurred from October 1, 2018 to 2019, which is the normal process for any revaluation in any town. As far as overall, the residential, single-family and multifamilies went up about 7%. Condos varied by complex. Some went down, some went up. It really, condos are unique. You have to value them looking at that complex. So you have somewhere, if they're, depending on the age, depending on the amount their monthly fees are, whatever, all that stuff comes into play with how the market sees them and how much they're willing to spend. Because that's basically what we're working. We're working with what people are willing to spend for these properties. We are then analyzing the sales so we can calibrate our cost models to reflect the current sale prices. Then we apply that to all the other properties in town. And that's the simple one-sentence explanation of what is a revaluation. If you look at the spreadsheet on the very far right where we have the median assessment ratio. Assessment ratio has nothing to do with your current value that we have set for 2019. It has everything to do with the direction that that value would go in. The median assessment ratio, which is the 2014 assessment divided by the recent sale that we're using in our analysis. What we want to be at for an assessment ratio, the perfect full 100% would be at a 0.70 if we were bringing our values to be equivalent, or appraised value to be equivalent of the sale. We're seeing here where the overall for the single family and the multifamily that it was 0.59. We're bringing it up to a 0.66, which means we are raising values to do that. We are raising rates, whether it be base rates, things like that for the different styles, whether we look at land sales, we look at residual land if we don't have a lot of land sales, which there are not a lot of residential land sales here, but we can determine the land value based on the building value minus the sale minus the building value gives you your residual land value.
If I could comment on that real quick. The reason it's at 0.66 instead of the 0.7, appraisal is basically an opinion value. There's no way you can get 100%. Everybody wants a specific number. They don't want, your house is worth between 200 and 250. They want to know it's 225. You can never do that as far as appraisals go. I instructed the reval company to come in about 4% less, just because we can't. There's no way possible to come in at 100%. Some of them are going to be a lot higher, some of them are going to be a lot lower. I want a little bit of a cushion for the revaluation just to give us a little bit of room to play with those numbers.
Yeah.
So we're not right at that 70%, trying to hit 100% of that sale.
Right.
Which is actually against appraisal practice. You can't chase a sale to get to hit exactly. Which you would never do with over 400 sales, 300 sales, or whatever. You'd never be able to do that.
Right.
Because you're always going to have outliers. But that's why we're at the 0.66 instead of the 0.7.
Okay. Also, there is a definite difference in, some neighborhoods went up in value, other neighborhoods, or price ranges rather, did not move as much. It's very typical in this market statewide for the larger homes not to hold as much value as they had in the past. Here, your very affordable prices, affordably priced homes have definitely increased in value. It doesn't mean they've gone up tens of thousands of dollars. It may mean that they've gone up $8,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 in assessed value. And that's simply going, if you look on the back of the page that we gave you, the old appraised value of this house that sold for $165,000 is very typical of what we were seeing. The old appraised value was $135,000, it's sold for $165,000. Our new appraised value now is $157,800. So basically, that's its old assessment ratio was 0.57, and now the new assessment ratio on this is 0.67, based on all our analysis.
So, someone on a house like this, what would the taxes have been before the rebound, and what would the tax be after the rebound?
Okay, your mill rate is at 38 and change, I believe. 37.
How much is it?
37.46. Jim, can you do the?
I don't have my
You don't have the calculator. Anyway,
I mean, we can't really give you a definitive answer on that.
But you can give me a ballpark.
That's even going to be harder. Well, it's difficult because there's going to be a shift from the commercial to the residential. So just because this house went up 16% doesn't mean it's going to take 16% of the taxes. If everything stayed the same, yes, it would go up 16% taxes.
I understand. I think she's just asking a straight question.
if everything was frozen, if
Everything was frozen.
everything was frozen, basically, yes, it would go up a little, it would go up a bit, basically, your 10 minus.
Well, I could tell you what numbers I got.
What numbers did you get?
37.11746 equal. At the current mill rate, the old assessed value of $94,780 comes to $3,550 in taxes. And if we use the same mill rate, which we don't know.
Right, which we don't know, but just to...
Just for sample purposes.
Yes, just for sample.
The assessed value of $110,460 comes to $4,137, or $138, say, to round up. So there's a difference there of about, what, $600?
Yeah, it's approximately 6 and 620, something like that.
580.
580, okay.
588 increase, yeah.
Yeah, over the year, so it's $50 a month.
Right, so I'm just thinking of being able to accurately explain to someone, because I know that there's going to be a hearing process.
Yes, there
right?
is.
So,
Yes, there is.
accurately being able to explain to someone that may not be able to afford $50 a month on their tax bill, because everything else is going up, for them to say that, just making us aware that that might be a true issue for someone.
Go ahead.
So you have to take into account too, that's if the town spent the same money, you would be taking that higher assessment value, dividing it into the grand list, so you would come up with a lower mill rate. So if you use the same exact mill rate with a higher revale, the town is actually generating more revenue.
And there's a shift to the commercial properties.
Yes, there is. There is a
Right, so I do know that there's a lot more that needs to be factored into this.
Right, there's a lot more.
Right, so I understand that,
Yeah.
but because we're being scrutinized by the people that are watching us on TV.
Yes.
I just wanted us to be a little bit more simpler with what we were doing, right? Because that's the first thing that someone thinks about. Oh my goodness, my property is going to be reevaluated. It's quite possible that my taxes are going to go up. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And so trying to alleviate some of that panic or some of those anxieties is why I'm asking the question, for us to be a little bit more mindful.
Right.
Yes,
I think
that's all.
what it is you have a very large stock of nice, affordable homes here. So you have a very active market. I have classmates of my kids who have bought homes here, and my kids are in areas where they're not buying homes. So,
Hi.
Hi.
A quick question.
Yes.
In this mystical process of revaluation, how do you take into account, I know a lot of it's based on demographics as well, it's part of the process of appraisal, the reduction in job growth, aging population, millennials that don't want to purchase and step up and own anything. I can understand what's happening to the McMansions because the demand for them may be diminishing. But how do you really, how do you come up with a real number for what these properties really are worth to the market? I mean, you're only looking at a couple of comparables for perhaps each, and spreading it all over the entire marketplace.
no, we're looking at all of the sales that have occurred in town that are qualified arm's length transactions. So we have well over 200, close to 300 sales that we use to calibrate the model to the market. We are looking at strictly what people are paying for houses. And we know it's an imperfect market. Some people make really good deals, and some people have to have that house and they pay a little bit more.
So these sales in the last year, 6 months?
These have the most weight. Analysis was started with the sales the year prior, so we've started with almost 500 sales to calibrate this.
And the sales are searched out to see that it was
Yes.
sold to a
Yes.
brother or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilor Cook, and then
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have two questions. The first one is to follow up on that question as far as the various properties. You said the sale. Does that factor in all the values, the larger homes compared to smaller homes? Is there a way for you to...
That's part of our analysis.
Okay.
We are looking at, we do look at the large homes versus the smaller homes. Our analysis has everything stratified by size and try to get those sale medians close to the same for every size. If they're off, if they show a trend, that tells the appraiser that they need to make an adjustment to the building size adjustment or something, so that the small houses are valuing at the same rate as the larger houses.
And a question, what percentage of, the notice that go out that you believe you're going to be able to go in and make those assessments and look at those properties, what percentage do you look at to say, okay, we're never going to get an opportunity to go in to revalue someone's property? For instance, one of my neighbors told me that someone came to her home and came in and looked around. What percentage are you projecting of folks within the town that may not respond to your notice or make a time for you to get in?
We don't have a projection of that. We did have a 41% entry rate of the ones that we were assigned to data collect.
Okay.
And we did get a 37% return of data mailers, which was in lieu of an inspection kind of a deal. Now, as far as the hearings coming up, the informal meetings, those start on Tuesday. They go through the 17th. The instructions are in their notice. They're online. If people have questions, they can make an appointment, and we will meet with them. At this point,
So if I didn't make an appointment, I did nothing, what would then happen?
your value
Okay.
is based on the data that's on your house
Okay.
and the cost model adjustments that were made based on the sales that have occurred in town, which have been applied to everybody.
And going back to this example that you had here with the all appraisal and the sale price,
Yes.
usually what happens there, that the homeowner may do some, updates, remodeling and so on, and that usually factor into...
If they
the
have
sale.
updated after the sale, that sale is no longer qualified because they've substantially changed that house.
Okay, okay.
And the math doesn't work right if you keep it.
Thanks.
Thank you. You don't have a feel yet, I would think, or unless I missed it, you've said, what the overall average percentage increase was in property, do you? I mean, was it, I saw it for...
The overall change before hearings, because we're still going to be making changes.
Yeah.
The overall, this is residential, commercial, anything taxable.
Yes.
That excluded exempt, that's plus 12%.
So if somebody goes up 2%, they're going to do better than
That's
probably
how the
a
math
decrease
works,
in taxes, so...
Yes, that's how the math works.
And the second question, and this may be a question for the assessor, are we going to be able to separate out real grand list growth not caused by the reassessment? New construction growth, so we have new things.
We can run that from the permits to see what kind of...
So, because when we have to...
Because that's included.
What's that?
Because that is included.
Yes, it's included,
Yeah.
but part of that is, if we have some real big development going on, like Seabear, I don't know if that's coming in, that will be a chunk that would have happened without our doing the revaluations. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
You're very welcome.
And it's 12% for everything.
Is there a motion for adjournment? All in favor? All those opposed? Motion carries.